the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Okay, so thanks everyone for taking the time. Amy and I are very excited about ESG and are really enjoying being able to talk to you about this. Oops. So today we're going to talk to you, give you a high-level view about what ESG is beyond sustainability, and we'll talk about really what ESG is and what the business values are in terms of materiality, stakeholder engagement, risk identification and mitigation, and roadmap building. So it's really beyond the scope of sustainability and how companies look and approach their ESG management. And then at the end, we'll field all of the questions. So we'll first move on to what ESG is. And so Amy, do you want to start? And just to make sure you're all seeing the presentation screen, right? I shared the right screen.
Yes, we are. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good.
Great. So welcome, everyone. We're super excited to be here with you tonight. And as we go through this, please jot down your notes so you don't forget those. So when we get to the breakout rooms, you'll have plenty of questions that we can maneuver through. What is ESG? So one of the things, obviously, there's lots of information about ESG in the public domain at the moment. It's on everybody's minds, companies, investors alike. There's just a lot of components swirling around it. When our team and practice area looks at ESG, we look at it from a very holistic approach. And so what that really means is when we're working with a client, no matter if they're public, private, small, medium, large size client, we're really looking at it from this holistic approach across their entire business enterprise. So what that really helps us do is look at their strategy components and then just kind of break that down from there. And if they, so to speak, like what you're seeing on the screen, if they're still very focused in the initial phases on their sustainability programs, then we'll go right in there with them. So as consultants, we're meeting the client really where they're at. So as we go through this, I'll kind of build upon that theme, and so will Susan. So we want to kind of kick it off that way. So definition of sustainability, many of you know that if you go type this into a Google search engine or whatever search engine you're using, you are going to find just a flurry of definitions. That's basically how companies feel about it on any given day and any given approach. And so settling on a definition, it can be very personal to a company, to what they're attempting to achieve, what is material to them, and so on and so forth. So how we kind of take a look at this is and kind of segment it a little bit, because again, it can blend into the ESG component. But when folks are out there looking at it from a pure sustainability perspective, it's really about that simple principle. Everything we need for our survival and well-being depends either directly or indirectly on our natural environment. So taking care of it, replenishing it, making sure that we're reducing waste, reusing different waste materials, products, all of those type of things can really come into play. So a big part of the business that we look at with our clients is also contained in life cycle assessment, or this whole concept of circular economy. So lots of different things kind of going into the sustainability mindset. But again, it just depends on where a company is, where they're evolving to, things that they have already in practice and what they're kind of looking at. If we go to the next slide, ESG, same kind of process, right? There's loads of definitions out there, lots of different ways to break it down. For those of you that might be new to this, it stands for environment, social, and governance, 3 key factors, and sustainability kind of fits into this process. And as I said earlier, it can look like an overarching sort of framework that can look at your performance, right? From an environmental perspective, from a social perspective, and then a governance perspective. And each of those have very broad and very, in-depth kind of components that it looks at. So when Susan gets to the presentation a little bit later and we talk about materiality, this is how you can kind of take this whole big wide world and then kind of push it into what's most material to our business, what should we be focusing on. So a couple of definitions up here. We try not to overindulge in definitions because, as I said, we think every company is unique. We take that approach. We want to look at it from a holistic view, how they're actually looking at it, what kind of leadership do they have around it? Are they at the beginning stages? Are they in a mature stage? So there's lots of different ways that we go about it. But what's important for all of you to kind of recognize as you kind of break a lot of this down is think about how investors, lenders, and insurance institutions look at it. So these boxes on the right just kind of help you sum it up. How do I want to think about ESG? So for an investment company, they're looking at these ESG components as filters to help them make decisions. So how well is a company performing in its environment, social, and governance, according to what is most material to that business, that company, that industry, that manufacturing entity, whatever that might look like. They're linking that ESG performance to the financial performance. So there are ways in which you can break this down a little bit further to actually kind of, assess how are you financially performing? Is that linked to those behaviors that are in your ESG performance realm? They can also look at divesting based on ESG reporting and that risk management components too. So what are core risks to the business? But also how do we report out on what those things look like? Now, we could do a whole seminar on reporting alone, but we won't go there today because it can get really complicated. But the most important thing that companies are really looking at is how do I look at what is material to my company, and am I mitigating, meaning reducing, looking at the risks that are associated with those material issues. So how do I manage those on a day-to-day basis? And for performance reasons, how am I either reducing that risk or looking for opportunities that are also coming from that risk assessment? So lots of different things kind of swirl around this from an investor, lender, and insurance institution. What's important to companies is, do they have investors? So there can be some pressure points there. Are they looking to reduce their insurance rates? Having a well-formulated ESG model and structure can really help showcase to your insurance, or maybe even a bank or a creditor, what you're actually doing that can actually improve what your scores are, your ratings, whatever that might look like from your perspective. But also coupled into this, which is why there's so much complexity around this and so many different variables to consider, is that you also have external pressure points that are coming into play here. And those can be, those external risks are becoming a lot more material to many companies and what they're attempting to do, whether that's increased regulatory, carbon policies, impacting their product and how they make it from start to finish, and just the increasing involvement of communities and what their growing expectations are like. And again, we could do, seminars on each one of these in a more full way, just because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of moving components, especially depending on what it is you're actually doing as a business. So lots of things to consider here. However, the real key is breaking it down so that it's digestible and really hyper-focused on what your business is doing and where you're attempting to manage your risk and your exposure to those risks. And then through that, hopefully you're also finding additional opportunities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is just a simplified way of breaking down environment, social, and the governance. And one of the key things to just note here is that each one of these bullets has a whole component of indicators and items that are attached to that companies will look at. So when you look at these lists, you're like, oh my gosh, this can be incredibly overwhelming. The idea here is, again, to use some of this to assess kind of what your current state is, and then where do you want to go, and then decide what gaps you have there in the middle. Again, always with that lens of looking at what's most material to your business. Okay, so if you're in the business like we are, we're a professional services company, so our carbon emissions is very, very low. The biggest part of our carbon footprint is our travel and getting on airplanes and flying around and doing that kind of component. But other companies may have much bigger footprints in the carbon emissions and what they're looking at. So how do we take inventory as stock of that, and how do we manage that, and what kind of performance metrics are we going to set to either reduce that and or improve in various categories that you're looking at. Social is a growing aspect. Environment and social have been around, as well as the governance components, obviously, for a very long time. This ESG lens, just think about it as a way of reframing your unique story to the company, as well as to what's happening in your business, and again, getting to what's most material. All right, Susan, let's go to the next one. So there has been an evolution because, as we typically say, most everyone out there as a company, as an entity, is doing something around any one of these components. So many of us are familiar, depending on how far you go back, environment, health, and safety started in the 1980s. Then it kind of morphed into this overarching component of corporate responsibility, adding a few more, compliance-driven, aspects to it, and industry standards and sort of best practices, and how you kind of evaluate yourself against other peer companies or competitors. And then around the early 2000s, and I was on forefront in the company that I worked for at the time, decided to really broaden this out even more and added in corporate social responsibility. So as you can see in this, sort of time frame, environment was a heavy focus area by most companies. And so the social responsibility component started to layer in, trying to understand more of what is happening on the social front. And this includes a heavy lens on your employees, right? So safety, occupational health and wellness, diversity, just the whole human capital, how we treat employees, labor standards, just a whole context of those types of things in there. And then eventually morphing into what we know today as ESG. And certainly where ESG really got sort of, for lack of a better word, placed on steroids, it was around 2019 in December when Larry Fink of BlackRock introduced this, just kind of putting companies on notice that here is what we expect going forward. So then as we turn the page in 2020, everyone's kind of absorbing all of this information and knowledge and going, oh, wow, you know, the investor community just put companies on notice with how they would really like to see environment, social, and governance performance, and how that was being raised just along the financial aspect of what companies are also reporting on. But then, as we all know, COVID hit in March of 2020. It didn't slow this process down. If anything, it really highlighted the need to really understand what's happening on the internal side and how you're managing those specific things, as health and occupational well-being all really took a front and center kind of scope for many companies. So it rejuvenated that employee social side of this equation too. And so then it gave companies that opportunity to really look at it. And now, as we know, it's really evolving very quickly. It's very dynamic. It's ever changing. And so you really have to stay kind of engaged in this process, looking at emerging trends, what's happening out there, how's it being reviewed. So let's go to the next slide. So these next two slides are just really quick, easy hits that we like to just kind of talk about. ESG implementation is a journey. Many companies have varying aspects of this depending on, like I said earlier, their ESG maturity stage. And basically, if they're starting, you know, at we're just getting started mode, then we're looking at what have you been doing, and then trying to formulate that into something that looks like more of a strategic overview lens, a holistic approach to what they want to do. So we're looking at what have they been doing in the past, kind of where they're at in this present state, and then obviously where are they moving in that future state. So it's continued, it's steady, it's going to keep evolving. Different regulations and standards are continuing to churn. Many of you may have been following the SEC regulations and kind of where that's going. Our team spent a great deal of time helping clients assess those and writing comments in. So there's a lot of different variables out there that are constantly moving around this space to try to keep, you know, a good, healthy lens on it. So it's a journey. And so the more that people think of it as a journey, the more they're going to kind of settle into the process versus feeling, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm in a ping pong match and I got to figure out this move and that move and the next move. Slow, steady, methodical, and building your foundational components really helps you continue to build on your ESG journey. And then the last slide before I turn it back over to Susan is really about data, right? And we have more data at our fingertips than we ever have had in the past. And being able to benchmark yourself, being able to, well, companies benchmarking themselves against their peers, competitors, but, you know, looking at what's our metric, what's going to be our KPI around each of these different ESG components that we decide we want that are material and we want to measure ourselves against. Those all really have I would say probably more of a hyper focus on what's the data and what's driving that. And so it's essential to really look at the information, both financial and non-financial, technical and non-technical risk, just to be able to evaluate kind of where are we today, what's our future state, and how are we going to close that gap? Because some of these things may take 2, 3, maybe even 5 years to change a trajectory or to build in capital expense so that companies can actually move forward on where they would like to be in their future state. And with that, we're going to continue on this theme of what's the business value. And so Susan's going to take us through some of the global business drivers.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, so the next section we'll talk about what really are the business drivers for why companies are adapting to ESG more. So the quote here on the right is from the Harvard Law School Forum and for corporate governance. And so this is really saying, a public opinion becomes more sensitive to social and environmental issues and more receptive to scrutiny of corporate practices. Companies, investors, and other market participants are more likely to become increasingly aware of the potential financial and reputational impacts of ESG management. So the idea is now that the drivers have gone beyond that financial gain and profitability to additional reputational risks. So things like looking at customer expectations and market demands are now stronger drivers, as well as the investor expectations. Lenders and insurance and surety markets have a larger driver on ESG. Impacts on operational efficiencies and effectiveness, cost reductions and improved margins, and as well as the potential enterprise risk mitigation. So looking at your risk, as Amy had mentioned earlier, holistically, and looking how to come through with a mitigation plan to make sure moving forward reduces all of the negative impacts. So this really sets the stage of why a company does choose to adapt the ESG framework and enforces a company's resilience and longevity. So you just want to share some ideas. These are, some ideas of what investors are saying now, which is really a big driver. And as Amy brought up a couple slides back, the kickoff on this was really from Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. So he started back in 2018 and 2019, started talking about different ways. In 2018, he wrote a letter to his CEOs titled A Sense of Purpose. And, from there, he started talking about investing differently and having a stronger way to have shareholder engagement to strengthen the communication between the shareholders and companies. And then in 2019, as Amy brought up, he expanded this in a letter called Purpose and Profits. And from there, he really talked about how investors should be socially responsible in their decision making. So he introduced the idea of ESG as far as BlackRock's investment stewardship through governance, including your company's approach to board diversity, corporate strategies and capital allocations, compensations that promote long-termism, environmental risks and opportunities, as well as human capital management. So this letter was the trigger, and as Amy said, the timing right before COVID helped. That COVID period and the lockdown helped people have this bigger awareness on workforce. And so, and if you have the chance, you should read each letter after, because each one subsequently talks about different aspects of ESG. He puts a lot on corporate risk and sustainability, as well as stakeholder engagement. Okay. Oops, there we go. So, and this is the ESG ecosystem map. So this is from the World Economic Forum, and it's really a snapshot of how all of the key players in this ESG realm relate to each other. So it helps you have a viewpoint of all of the frameworks, the standards, the data drivers, everything together, how they relate to each other and what they are. So it is a way that has been put out there to help someone navigate, a simple way to navigate through there. And if you give me a second, I will bring up, I have to find it. Where did it go? Oops, sorry, wrong letter. Oh, it went away. It is right here. Okay, that's why the Zoom meeting came above it. So here is the live framework. It's probably even changed since we had that image, because this is, as it's evolving and it's always changing. So from here, we can look through of all the different key players, and you can click through. So we'll look at frameworks, and here we'll go through the task force for climate related financial disclosures, which is TSDF. And this is one actually that BlackRock has put a lot of investment in. And here it gives you a sort of a fact sheet on each of those players and helps navigate through. So this can be a really valuable tool to help try to go through all of that information that gets put out there in terms of ESG and all of the categorizations and key links and key information. Here it is. It popped up on a different window. I'm sorry. Here's the fact sheet. And it helps navigate through all of that. So from there, now we'll move on to materiality. So now that window won't go away on my screen. Sorry. So with materiality, we'll look at the value that a company has. Oh, sorry.
What?
Amy?
No, I'm listening to
Oh, no.
webinar. I'm kind of just
sorry. So I think if everyone could have on mute, that's not asking a question. Thanks. So we'll go through materiality now and the value of defining materiality as a pathway to ESG. So first thing, what is materiality? So it's really the process of defining ESG topics that matter most to a business and its stakeholders. So it defines what's unique to that business based on business strategy, the projects of that company, the location, and ultimately informs that company strategy, targets, and reporting. So it's really not practical for a company to address every single ESG topic out there. There's a lot, as you can see from that framework, there's a lot of information, a lot to address. So if you go in there and you take a step at materiality and address all of these topics and what can truly be material to you as a company and to your stakeholders, you're able to put better focus on addressing all of the needs that are really important to your culture, your business culture, your stakeholders, and your goals. Okay, not changing, there you go. So this is our materiality assessment model that we've developed to help our clients navigate through trying to assess materiality. So it's really a more simplified approach to help a company sort of navigate through that craziness and to simplify that for them. So we help the company through this model break it down and digest materiality in 6 basic steps, where flexibility is the key. So the bottom line is this model just helps companies that start feeling overwhelmed as all these ESG topics get thrown at them, as emerging issues come up, to help really figure out, well, this may be an emergent issue, but is it material to us? Is it material to our stakeholders? Does it fit in our business culture? So this helps them look through the stages from where they are by developing a baseline, looking at those material issues, and running through implementation. And ultimately, it shows that companies may have similar material profiles. Different companies with different cultures have different material profiles, but even if they're similar, their approach and how they undertake it can really vary as well. And this shows really how materiality has accelerated over the years. So, pre-2000, it was really not something that companies commonly looked at. It was really based on their discretion that they would go in. And then as standards and frameworks came into play and more value was placed, the UN released standards, everything sort of increased over time to this point where we have in the upper right what we call dynamic materiality. So now instead of just setting a material baseline, setting that, following it year over year and consistently, what now is happening are companies have a more dynamic approach to materiality. They'll constantly review at frequencies their materiality, base it on factors. Are there business changes where something that was not material to me before is now more important? Are there emerging issues that we need to focus on? So having this routine review and this dynamic materiality helps the company get a better grasp on things, helps them communicate better with stakeholders, which includes shareholders, internal stakeholders, their workforce, and really builds a stronger message.
And I might add before Susan leaves this slide is I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with GRI and some of the acronyms that are on here, but GRI was released, in sort of that 2000 timeframe, the Global Reporting Initiative, and this is where many companies use that framework as they were developing, what they're reporting out from a non-technical components, elements. So things that would fall out typically in the E, the S, and the G. But as time marched on here, you see the ISO collaboration to 26,000, then SASB was founded in that 2011, 2012 timeframe. What was really kind of really interesting as you kind of look at the SASB standards when they were released up there around that 2018 timeframe is just looking at GRI and SASB getting together to really kind of GRI is kind of here's all of the various indicators and the E, the S, and the G that you can look at, and there's some 300 to 400 of those indicators. But SASB, in collaboration with them, broke it down by industry and then by sector, looking at what would be most material from the GRI full, component list. So these things keep evolving. I think that's more the storyline here. You see TCFD, that's the task force on climate financial related disclosures, and when it was released, and obviously we see TCFD being an incredibly big piece of what investors are looking at as well. So there's only a few on this list here from just looking at this from a materiality acceleration viewpoint. But if we were to pull this slide into a part 2 and to showcase all of the different components that have come in, it would be a pretty busy looking slide. So again, a lot just about the evolution here and the acceleration of where this is going has just really taken off in the last few years.
Okay, oops, there we go. Okay, so this actually is an example of materiality. So this isn't one that we've performed this. We pulled, it's public domain. It's PayPal's materiality from 2021. And again, this might not even be what they consider material anymore if they've conducted their dynamic materiality, but it does show it's a good example because it's a financial technical firm. So you can see how what topics they are material and the ones that are obvious. So if you look in the upper right quadrant, the gray quadrant, it's obvious that they have cybersecurity and data privacy as their really material topics. But what might not have been obvious to you, but through them with, how they've interacted with stakeholders, with how they view their company, is diversity and inclusion is also very important to them. So their workforce and diversity, all the way through their leadership may be something of incredible value to them. And then, you could look all the way down to some of the environmental. Everything on here is material to the company, but they are ranked by what's important to them and their stakeholders. So in this case, they do have less priority or less material topics for environmental, like waste and water, where it might be different for a manufacturing company that generates through their manufacturing processes more waste, or they have more probability of having discharges to water, to surface waters or groundwater. So if you look at that and you think about it in terms of the business culture, and you can see how this is really custom to this type of industry. So now I'm going to pass this back on to Amy, who will go through stakeholders for you. Amy?
Yes. So, so as we kind of cascaded through this, we never want to leave the stakeholder value out of the equation. It's incredibly important. You have internal stakeholders, you have external stakeholders, and kind of looking at one, how external stakeholders can put pressure on your business, as well as how your internal stakeholders can put pressure on your business, i.e. in the form of your employees. Maybe your board is usually considered an external stakeholder and they can put pressure on. You have just a variety of different things going on. So for most companies, it's really relevant to take a look at who are their stakeholders. It's a very important part of the process. What is their interest in your business? What's their capability of influencing what happens to your business, and or both? And so when we look at materiality, we include this component of evaluating who your stakeholders are due to the fact that they can put certain pressure points. So for example, when Susan was showing the PayPal one, diversity and inclusion was way up there in that quadrant, but it was more focused up on the importance to their stakeholders. So they are having that conversation, and or board and or customers are putting pressure on them. And when you're selling a product, a platform, in their case, a technology platform, the whole goal is more users, more profitable. So at that point, they need to reconcile what that pressure looks like. So when you're in the public domain and you've got that information out there, what your workforce demographics look like, you're going to say to yourself, is this really where we want to be? Or do we have a gap that we need to fill? So for example, if they're looking at their board and they lack minorities and women, they may set a goal for themselves to actually, when those board seats vacate, what are they going to be doing to add more diversity to that board mix? So again, all very calculated, all very important part of their strategy, and all things that take time to evolve and to mature. So stakeholders become a very, very important part of this. When Susan's mentioning a manufacturing company, obviously, regulators, EPA, to whatever that might look like, all are incredible important stakeholders to how your business is run, how you're staying compliant, and making sure that you're able to showcase and talk confidently about how you're doing that. So if we go to the next slide. Obviously, a stakeholder engagement is important. So a lot of what we do is help our clients understand not only who they're identifying, but what is the frequency of those types of engagements, right? So if I'm a heavily regulated industry, I'm going to have people inside my firm that are heavily focused on making sure that they're staying lockstep with those various regulators, what the needs are, the changing regulations, and how that may work. So there's a process for identifying who they are, how do we map them, and how do we prioritize them? And then more importantly, how do we want to engage them? What's the frequency of that? Without overstepping a boundary, because you want to make sure that you're staying engaged and not unduly influencing anyone. But to the other side of that equation is if I'm in an oil and gas component or mining, and that's a very invasive process into a community, who are those stakeholders and how am I engaging with them, and how am I keeping them informed of what my operating aspects are and how I'm mitigating risks and impacts to them and to their local space. So it can go from very sort of benign relationships to very complex and very complicated relationships. But having a key focus on that helps reduce risk and minimize those impacts that a company may feel. So stakeholders are very important, building trust, maintaining that trust, is incredibly important. It's your reputation, your public perception, getting confidence around who those stakeholders are, building confidence in that you know what you're doing, you know how your business runs, and you're taking care of everything from safety to wellness to health, all of those things that may influence them. And then maintaining that buy-in, very, very important to continue that process. Where we see these things fading quickly is companies that have very long engagements with their stakeholders. If it's short term, it seems to be they're all in there doing their thing. But we stress to our clients that long-term approaches are more in sync with what you want to really do to maintain trust, confidence, and long-term buy-in. Because when you have an issue, you shouldn't just be knocking on their door. You should have built that relationship and trust for the long haul. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is just summarizing, again, why is this important? Mitigates potential risk and conflict. So think about protests. I used energy as an example. If you think about, the various pipelines and the protesting that goes on with those pipelines, not in my backyard. A lot of times that means companies have not, completed their due diligence and working with those stakeholders to minimize those potential risks and or conflicts that they might have. Understanding your stakeholders shouldn't be a scary thing. Sometimes we have companies like, oh gosh, I don't want to engage Greenpeace in what I'm doing. And the idea is that sometimes perception is that stakeholder group's reality. So the more that you engage with them, the more they understand what you're doing, what your operations, how safe you operate, the different kind of components and safeguards that you put in place. All of that matters and can kind of reduce that potential conflict and risk. Sharing your strategic direction and all your plans helps them stay informed. And then just tapping into your local stakeholders can really improve your own knowledge and local opportunities that may present themselves. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This slide we created because we felt that sometimes just talking about groups of stakeholders doesn't always really kind of hit it the way that you would like it to do, but this just integrates stakeholders as a interrelationship between what you do in environment, social, and governance involves all of these different types of stakeholders. And mapping that through, understanding that how these all interrelate to each other can really help not only people who lead and these kind of ESG or sustainability teams within inside of companies, but also can help spread the knowledge and the information across your business enterprise so that people feel very connected to the who, the what, the why, and how the when, like when do we need to engage, especially in certain aspects of what our business is doing. So just another way to just kind of go, okay, here's the whole, sort of picture model of how ESG and stakeholders kind of are very important in the process. Okay, next slide. So we'll talk about the continuing on our business value risk-based approach. I'm going to turn it back over to Susan.
So now, companies have gone through their materiality assessments. They know what truly is material to them. They've worked with their stakeholders. They have an idea of what's important to their stakeholders. So the next step is really, taking a risk-based approach to look at how to incorporate and create a good ESG strategy. So, this is really a tool or a process, the high-level process of what we do to approach risk management with our clients. It's really the basis behind a lot of our ESG strategies where, a company looks at its risk profile and then identifies the risks. And, through that risk, we often look at it using a framework or a standard. So Amy brought up GRI from that chart. There's SASB has standards, and looking at it in terms of those standards helps you get a broad stroke. So, looking at all of these categories, because if you're just sitting down and building a risk matrix, or a risk register and looking at where all your risks lie without any kind of guidance, you might be missing something that's very important, risks to your reputation, or, you haven't gone through that and talk to your stakeholders about how important biodiversity is to them, or restoration after a project's done. So going through and basing your risks and identifying them based on a framework actually helps, broaden that brush to make sure that you're collecting all of those ESG risks. So you identify them through some sort of framework, you analyze them and look at them in terms of how likely these risks are to occur, or how severe an occurrence would be, an impact would be on your company, either reputationally, financially, if something did occur, and applying that with materiality. Now you're taking the step and you're able to prioritize them. So all of this helps build that risk management plan. So you have the prioritization, you can go through and create a mitigation plan that helps you monitor those risks, helps you avoid those risks, helps mitigate if something were to occur. And you can really pull that through and really focus on things like climate risks, or, like I said, biodiversity, or even human rights and ethical labor practices. And all of that goes through and helps build a strong ESG strategy. Okay.
And I would also just add to this that when you want to get a CEO's attention or a board's attention, this is the way to do it. When you could speak in risk, no matter if it's the E, the S, or the G, those are the things that they are hyper-focused on. And one of the things that we notice is that, companies may have really good risk processes, but they may be lacking in including the S as a social risk. Or maybe they pass their governance risks off to, a third-party consultant of some sort. But being able to pull it in through this whole process and putting E, the S, and the G through that helps them see it from a totality view, right? And so those are some core things that also kind of look at performance, cost. Is it strategic? Is it a part of our strategic plan moving forward? How do these risks, kind of materialize themselves into what we need to stay focused on year over year, or maybe it's a short-term focus until it's established or set in the pathway that the company is looking at.
Okay. And actually, before we move on, the last thing that is important about your risk management strategy is also monitoring, not just from monitoring the current risks, but again, assessing things that could contribute to risk. So any new emerging trends, any changes in your business culture. We had an acquisition that brought in new business that so looking at those sorts of things also help you decide, oh, we have to reevaluate our risk profile. We have to see what we need to do to, further mitigate risks. So that monitoring step, as well as identification and creating the plan, the monitoring is actually very important to make sure that you're following through to ensure that you've captured everything. So, which leads to the click was not on cue, sorry, the biggest piece of this, and that is developing your total ESG management strategy or management system. Sure.
Susan, we have 5 more minutes.
Okay, this is the last slide. So what I'll do is I'll just shorten this, that the whole point of the management system is to incorporate everything from materiality. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We had roadmap, but Amy, if you want to touch on that briefly. Okay. So So basically, it takes all of the components together, from materiality to stakeholder engagement, all of the risks, and helps put a systematic approach in making sure you're not doing these random acts of sustainability kindness. So before ESG, everyone was going out there and just doing things based on emerging trends, which really was not sustainable and could be costly in the long run from a financial perspective, or it was only for a reputation. And so having this systematic approach can really help a company have longevity in ESG strategy and eventually into the corporate strategy. So then business, Amy, do you want to go through this and wrap it up?
Yeah. So basically, as we wrap up here, just keep in mind that understanding what you know and what you don't know is incredibly important to businesses, right? And there's lots of ways in which to navigate what you don't know. But just being crystal clear on what that looks like can be really very important to their overarching strategy and how they built this out. But there's, I guess, the whole idea for us here, and kind of what the takeaway is just, we look at things through that risk-based lens. We want it to be material to your business. And we also want you to look at, how are you evaluating it? What's your current state? Where do you ideally want to be? And then what are the gaps, and how are you going to go about assessing those gaps to get to your future state? So it's just technically a gap analysis, and that can be very refreshing to many people because it can feel very overwhelming. So just take everything bite size by bite size, and it really can make a big difference on how you progress what you're doing. The next slide is just a roadmap, and we use this, and we built this to help our clients kind of pull them back to ease, that if you build some foundational things and get really good at just really understanding who you are as at your baseline, benchmark against your competitors and peers, make sure you understand what your pressure points are, put it through a risk, look at your emerging issues, any regulatory changes, stay focused on materiality, develop your strategy, and then look at how you're going to report and communicate that. Those can be more of the simplistic avenues to just really focus on building solid foundations. So that's kind of our component to, kind of trying to give you in 45 minutes what ESG might look like. And so I'll turn it back over to Dibs, and we can look at moving into the breakout section.